Well, good evening. And I do want to reassure those of you that were here at the beginning that my only interest in kingfishers is to photograph them. So if you know precisely where they are along that river Froome between the weir and the little bridge, do let me know. But over the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at the subject of fasting. Not one that we would necessarily automatically think, oh, yes, I really want to have a look at that. And the first 3 weeks, we've looked at developing our relationship with God, to offer ourselves to Jesus more, to grow in holiness. And then last week, Tom talked us through amplifying our prayers. Now, fasting is one of the spiritual disciplines as described by the late, great John Wesley. He refers to it as a means of grace. God has so much grace available to heal, to forgive, to bring peace and freedom. And things like prayer and fasting and worship and Bible reading are by means by which we can receive that grace. But we can't earn God's grace. But by prayer and fasting, we position ourselves to communicate more clearly and strongly with God. It's as simple as that. We're just positioning ourselves to receive God's grace more easily. Now, we all want to hear God speak louder and clearer into our lives, don't we? When we're seeking that guidance, that word of knowledge. But I want to reassure you, there's no special magic with fasting. It's simply an opportunity that God has given us to draw closer to Him. It's just a very simple discipline that He's given us. So relax. Just relax and just let this just speak to you. Let God soften your heart about the whole subject. And try to put behind you maybe any sort of polarized views that you may have come to previously. So after the last 4 weeks, I am pretty certain that in many houses across Stoke, Gifford, there's been some pretty heated discussions in families about fasting. I think we seem to have very clear understanding or views of what we think it is or what it has been for us in the past. But from the reports that we've heard, there have been some wonderful time spent with God as a result of trying fasting over the last few weeks. I really do believe that we should give this more prominence. But let's not kid ourselves. It is not easy. And as Tom told us last Sunday evening, it's really tough. And God knows that it's tough. And that's why I think it's been mentioned more than once through the Bible, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, to remind us how valuable this gift is to us. So as we come to our 4th week and final week, we're looking tonight at the subject of standing with the poor. Now, this is quite a change of direction from the previous 3 weeks, it's fair to say, where we've been looking very much at ourselves and our relationship with God. But this week, we're looking much more on the impact on others, our community, and the power of social transformation. This is one aspect of fasting that you probably have not necessarily considered before. You may not think of fasting as the vehicle for the biblical version of justice. But in the imagination of the Bible writers, it is. It answers the question of fasting, so what? And what difference will it really make to me and my life and those around me? And there are 2 areas of action that we'll be looking at. And it sort of forks. In one way, it goes towards justice, and the other way towards giving generously to the poor. Now, in our 2 morning services, Chris Reveley spoke more about the idea of justice within this subject. And this evening, I'm going in the other direction, looking more at our giving to the poor. So please look at them both together, because you're kind of getting two for the price of one. And if you haven't heard Chris already, then do go to our YouTube channel and catch up during the week. So we're going to look at this under just three very simple 3 points. First of all, who are the poor? Then secondly, why stand with the poor? And then clearly the final and very practical one of how do we do it? How do we do it? So let's look at that first one at the very beginning. Who are the poor? What does it mean to stand with the poor? What does it even mean to be poor? And who are the poor? In Hebrew culture, poor means of low social status. So women, children, the sick, the elderly, tax collectors, who were most definitely shunned in society, and most definitely those affected by leprosy, because they were believed to have been cursed due to sin in either their current life or a past life. And even today in some countries, leprosy still is considered in the same way, preventing many people even considering the fact that it's a disease that can be healed. Now, Jesus shows his compassion in many, many times that we see in the Bible. Accounts of him speaking and acting with those that he considers poor and marginalized. But there's so much more depth to the word poor, because as always, Jesus talked much more than just the obvious poor. There's also the emotionally poor, the physically poor, the socially poor. The response of Jesus, as is always, is to reach out and touch and deal with it, and then ask questions later if necessary. By sticking with the most obvious poor first, the stark reality is that we live in a world where there is an unfair distribution of wealth right across the Earth's population. And according to World Vision, a quarter of the population of the world suffer some form of poverty. But more alarmingly, they quote that by 2030, this will increase to half of the population. Now that's staggering, isn't it? Really, really is. Now, there are many terms that we use to describe the poor. Mainly for clarity and statistical purposes, it's fair to say, from at one end of the spectrum, extreme poverty, and at the other end, and I've got to read this because it's a bit of a lengthy description, living in fragile contexts characterized by impoverished conditions and dire circumstances. Well, the evidence is there that we are seeing many, many more people that are struggling today. And that is even in our rich Western country. And the gap that is there between the poor and the rich is ever growing larger. And one thing I do know, that this is not God's intention of how we are to live our lives. We have enough resources in this world for everyone, but they're just not fairly shared among us. It is this injustice that brings so much anger and frustration to people and unhappiness, and leads so often to violence that we see in the world. We often struggle to understand, why is there so much violence in our world? But it is as a result, I believe, of this unfairness. One country that I do know about is Mozambique in Eastern Africa. And it's one example of how this unfairness has exploded into violence. In Cabo Delgado province, which is in the north area of Mozambique, Militant attacks has claimed nearly 3,000 lives, and it has displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and not least staff from the leprosy mission, for whom I have worked for 10 years. And the massive gas project that should be producing a real source of income for this poor country, that whole business has been disrupted. Now, this insurrection has impacted and delayed the work of the leprosy mission too. We're in a major project to build 40 community hubs in the rural areas in the northern part of Mozambique, particularly in this province of Cabo Delgado. And that will bring identification of new cases of this disease, bring healing, education to the community, bring the community together in unity. And it is being impacted as a result. But I'm pleased to say that at least our staff have been able to move back to where they were now, as things have quietened down a bit. But it is sadly clear to see how and why so many people just feel that they have no alternative but to join with these violent insurrections. But it's not all doom and gloom. So let's park that for now. Until I retired actually in December, a couple of months ago, I've worked for the last 12 years raising funds to support the extreme poor with an international housing charity called Habitat for Humanity, and then subsequently the leprosy mission. And I've witnessed firsthand the difference that you and I can actually make with so little. It's as though God places that miracle of magnifying the amount of money given every time. Now, you may not be able to experience the opportunity to go and to show care and love and to pray with those that suffer in these situations. But you can help support that work, or many other incredible mission works that God is doing around the world. One other person that I met last year in Nepal is a gentleman by the name of Kancha. He's 85. He lives in this leprosy colony just outside the capital city of Kathmandu. And he's lived in this leprosy colony for over 60 years. He met his wife there. They've been married now for 55 years. But he's had no opportunity to go anywhere else. Rejected by his community, he had to leave and step out and take that role of being marginalized by no choice of his own. And this is where we can step in and make a difference. So that answers our first question of who are the poor? It covers a big spectrum of people, not least those that we see around us in our community in Bristol, but also clearly around the world too. So our second point is why? Why are we called to stand with the poor? Let's have a look at our reading, which is from Isaiah chapter 58. It will come up on the screen. And we're reading from verses 3 to 9. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and you exploit your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice, untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, "Here am I." If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and you and your night will become like noonday. What amazing words from Isaiah. God is speaking here through the prophet Isaiah to the people of Israel, who are intended to be a kingdom of priests, an example to the world of how we should live and to reign in the wider world. But they were failing miserably. God's people through the ages have been no strangers to feeling abandoned. And in Isaiah 58, we hear that God's people are facing oppression, having been dragged out of Jerusalem and to be taken into the neighboring country of Babylon. The prophet Isaiah repeatedly called out their actions, their rejection of God, and their lack of kindness to the weak. Isaiah doesn't hold back at all. They have been fasting to seek help from God, but when that help doesn't come, they complain. One of the big questions that the book of Isaiah poses is, what is God looking for from you and me in worship? And this chapter 58 gives a crystal clear picture of what he expects from us, but also what he promises in return. As we look at verse 3, it says, "Yet on the day of fasting, you do as you please and exploit your workers." And then again in verse 5, is this what you call a fast? God is not impressed at all with their fasting. But why? It was because God knew their hearts. Their hearts were far from him. On the outside, it looked like they were doing everything right. They were godly and sacrificial. They had it all together. That they were devoted to God and loved him. But God saw through that facade. It was an empty ritual. They only fasted to have answers to their difficult situation that they were struggling with, and without any heart change. As they fasted, they were fighting amongst themselves and taking advantage of their laborers. They should have been upholding justice, protecting the oppressed, the weak. God doesn't need them to go on a day without food, to have inward turned piety, focusing on themselves and what they can get. No. He wants them to have an outward turned love for others. When God didn't meet their expectations, they complained. They said, "Lord, we observe the religious practices, but you don't seem to notice us. Why won't you come and help us?" They just can't see that the problem is the state of their own hearts. And I wonder if you found yourself in a similar situation. It may well be that you feel that, yes, I attend church every week. I'm never late. I attend all the prayer meetings. But I don't hear from you, God. I cannot get an answer to my questions. Now, around 700 years later, Jesus identified a very similar problem again. And on this occasion, it is still very much a heart problem in his day. especially among the Pharisees and the leaders, religious leaders, I say. They fasted to be noticed by others. But Jesus said in Matthew 6, "But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." We see there back in Isaiah 58 and verse 6, "Is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen?" God is saying here that fasting is not only to offer ourselves to God. It's not only to grow in holiness. It's not only to amplify our prayers. There's much more to it. It's to fight injustice, to free people from oppression, to share our food with the hungry, to provide shelter for those that don't have it, to clothe the naked, to meet the practical needs of people all around us. Therefore, and don't you love it when you get a therefore in the Bible? I love them. Therefore, if you practice this kind of fasting, then listen what will happen. As we read on in verse 8, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guide. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, "Here am I." This is a whole new dimension to fasting than the previous 3 sessions. Less to do with us and more to do with others, and in particular, the poor. God wants each of us to have a changed heart, a sincere heart, a loving heart, which is expressed through our actions. God longs to get behind the smokescreen of what we present to the world and to get to our inner spiritual life. Worship starts from the heart and overflows into every other part of our lives. We were powerless to change our own hearts or to rescue ourselves. But God showed indescribable love when he sent his son Jesus to die and to rise again, conquering death and sin for us, for you and for me. He awakened our hearts by his Spirit. Jesus' death and resurrection was the perfect act of worship. Perfect act of worship. And for us, true worship begins when we recognize that Jesus died for us, that he rose again and forgives us. Worship is our response after we have trusted in him. But our worship doesn't end there. So looking at our third and final point, the how. We know now what it is to be poor, why we should stand with them, but how do we do it? I think, I really don't fancy the idea of standing with the poor. It's a bit tricky, but listen. The long-standing word, in fact, going back through the centuries for being generous to the poor, is almsgiving. Now, it's not a word that you will hear every day by any means, and you may have only have heard it in connection with almshouses. And these were properties that commenced really way back in medieval times to provide housing and shelter and to care for the elderly, poor, and homeless. The ones that we see nowadays are mainly from the Victorian era. And they're built in this very neat 3-sided square with a nice bit of green and some gardens in the middle. And this was all to emphasize a sense of community and unity within that. And these were often run by churches and other good charitable foundations. But more than simply giving money, almsgiving is an act of love. An act of love that can deepen our prayer life and bring a greater sense of meaning to our fasting. Almsgiving incorporates the spiritual practices of prayer and fasting in a way that manifests itself for caring for our neighbours in need. It can deepen our prayers as we are brought into contact with our community. There are still many that are living in poverty, not far from us. And this can give us a greater understanding of their circumstances and what it means to go without. Now, in the same way that it's hard to imagine fasting without prayer, it's just as illogical to practice fasting without generosity, service, and justice. Everyone is created in the image of God and has a huge value to Him. Just think about that for one moment. That means that everyone should be respected, treated with dignity, respect, and compassion. So to reflect His character, God's people, you and I should defend the poor and fight for justice for the marginalized. That's what true worship looks like. So how does it look in practice? What do we actually need to do? What can we do to stand with the poor? We've looked at the who and the why of fasting, but how do we put this into practice? Well, here is a few suggestions that one of those might just fit comfortably with you. So first of all, we need to stand in solidarity with the hungry. Chris used a great example this morning when he was speaking of the demonstration of people in Russia, in Moscow. I think it was last week, at the funeral of Alex I can't quite remember the name, but the real politician, a Christian politician that was standing against Putin. And the people came out. It's a dangerous thing for them to do in Moscow. But they just came out and they stood together to be seen that they stood for justice. And we can do similar things as well. Now, this is also by going regularly, perhaps without food or some other thing, providing that, as we previously said, that is safe for you to do. But secondly, we can deny our stomach something to do something for our heart. You begin to feel the compassion of God as maybe those pangs of hunger hit you in the middle of the afternoon during a day of fasting. But we're standing with the poor. We can give up the money that might have been spent on our breakfast and lunch or even dinner maybe and give that to the poor. Various ways in which that can happen. And maybe for some it's simply giving a regular gift to a charity that is clearly working with those suffering in poverty. But I'd also like to suggest that just by increasing our giving to St. Michael's on a monthly basis is also doing the same thing. Because the church is supporting various actions around in our local community, nationally and internationally as well. So it might be just the simplest thing for you is just to increase your monthly giving to the church here. But there are other ways that we can do this. We can give time in service. Not everybody will have so much time available, but some do. You can volunteer in so many different ways. There are community activities of all ages that we can become a part of, from young and old. even volunteering in the coffee shop. Sue will be very appreciative of that happening, I know, but we're providing a needed service in this community. But there are many other causes. There's the Bristol Church's night shelter in the colder months of the year, the food bank, the retirement village in Stoke Gifford, the care homes, mother and baby groups, over 65 lunch. There's many different things that we can all get involved in. But then lastly, we can fundraise or volunteer to fundraise with a national or international charity that perhaps reaches out to those more extreme poverty, those people that just absolutely nobody seems to speak up for. Now, over the last 12 years, I have been working to support and to raise money for that type of work. Initially, in building houses in countries around the world where people had nothing. And it's in a partnership whereby they would provide their time, their labor, and Habitat for Humanity would provide the finance and the resource to provide the opportunity to build a home. And if we can see this first picture here, you can see some of the homes that are built. It really depends on which country this charity is working because they will be very culturally built. This one is quite a posh one, to be honest. It's built with bricks. That's not always the case. But then also, we need to reach out. Reach out and touch the issue. We need to do that. Not just, we need to reach out. You know you do. And then last year I met, not last year. This has gone a slightly different order. No, okay, let's stick with this one for the moment. This is young Santosh in Nepal, a double amputee as a result of leprosy. An incredible inspiration is this lad, but we've been able to help him, to support him with a home, bit of transport, a little scooter, as well as the training to enable him to support himself and his family. If we can go back to the picture that you showed last, yes, this one. Sammy in Nigeria. I met him in 2020. Extraordinary character in a leprosy settlement, as they call them in Nigeria, with a bit of school, some health provision, just being there to help them be more independent. And Sammy here took on the role of being like the police and the security there. He used to be a policeman in his earlier years. And he's transformed various bits from a bicycle to build what is actually a tricycle, because you wouldn't really want to see his feet. But he can't walk at all. And he uses that trike to get himself around. And then I think probably our last picture, again in Nigeria, these children, I presented them with new shoes, new school uniform, a backpack, and pencils and paper and books for them at school. And as you can see, the joy on their faces is just extraordinary. Now, we can't all go to these far-flung places and do this, but we can support those that are able to. And you may just find that this and many other Christian charities is the way that you can help stand with the poor, make a difference, care, bring love, healing, education, and training to help lift people out of poverty. It's offering a hand up rather than a hand out. A hand up. We need to open our minds. We need to fast and pray and to hear from God and allow Him to direct us where we can be the best that we can be. We need to position ourselves in prayer and fasting to hear from God in the best way and easiest way to communicate without distractions. And in the words of the Tim Hughes song that we will sing shortly of God of Justice, keep us from just singing and move us into action. Perhaps Rachel and the band, you would like to come up now as we come to end. In Isaiah, we read about that amazing promise. That despite Israel messing up repeatedly, when they call to him, repent, there's the promise. He will answer their prayers and his presence will be with them. But they needed to change their hearts. And this is the promise for us too. When we draw close to God in prayer and fasting and we humble ourselves to reflect his character, to stand with the poor, he will draw close to us and he will answer our prayers. So as we close this challenging series on fasting, where do you stand with it now? I hope, like me, that you've moved on from where we started a few weeks ago. I used to really, really struggle to fast, I have to admit. All I could think of was, I'm hungry. This is distracting me from prayer. But I've realized that there's a different perspective to look at this, and it's God's perspective. And I've really grown through these weeks, and I most definitely will continue a weekly day of fasting. So where is your heart this evening? Softened by that overwhelming love and grace of Jesus for each of us. So many things are broken in our world. Broken spirits, broken relationships, broken hearts. But together we can serve God with a sincere heart. We can make a difference. We can walk in obedience in God's strength. And we will stand with the poor and bring a touch of heaven to earth. I'll just leave you with these final words from Isaiah 58. Then you will call and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help and he will say, here am I. Amen.